The seats were filled with residents, students, and reporters, all drawn by his name but staying for his words. "People ask if I survived because I was a colonel," he began, voice steady. "Maybe. But what if I wasn't? What if I had no rank, no Pentagon line? Would I be here, or just another name in the news, lost to noncompliance?" The room was still, every face absorbing the weight of his question. He didn't recount the stop, the slurs, or the boot. Instead, he spoke of Tiana's letter, Lila's courage, and the community's voices now archived, no longer silenced. "Justice isn't for the decorated or the connected," he said, unfolding the paper. "It's a human right, not a privilege earned by rank." He read the line aloud, "Justice should be the default, not a fight." The words landed, not as a slogan but as a truth, and the room exhaled together, aware of the work still ahead. Marcus stepped down, no applause needed. He walked past nodding faces, each a reminder that he wasn't alone. At the door, he tucked Tiana's letter into his notebook, not as a trophy but as a map. He'd come back to this road, not to end the pain but to confirm he'd moved through it. As he drove east, the rising sun warmed the dashboard, and Marcus felt lighter, not forgiven, but free. To everyone who's followed this journey, thank you. You've walked with Marcus through fear, defiance, and hope. If his story moved you, hit subscribe on Revenge Ties and join us, where every voice tells a story of struggle, strength, and a new start. Share it, comment, and keep fighting for your truth. We'll meet you on the road ahead. By evening, the team flagged Dan's reports as administrative distortion risks, a rare label that stripped them of legal weight. Marcus left the office, the USB drive in his pocket like a grenade he'd chosen not to pull the pin on yet. He drove home, the road dark but familiar, and thought of his son, Jamal. "I'm doing this for you," he whispered, not to absolve his past but to ensure his son's future wouldn't carry the same scars. The fight wasn't over, but Marcus felt a shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was rewriting the rules. Marcus Tate sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold beside him. The morning news played softly, reporting a new twist in his case. Judge William Holt, Ryan's uncle, had sent a memo to the Internal Oversight Board, urging them to reconsider the suspensions of Dan and Ryan. The words were cloaked in legal jargon, but Marcus saw them for what they were, an attempt to shield family, to bend justice. His jaw clenched, remembering his father's warning, "Power protects its own." Marcus had risen to lieutenant colonel to escape that truth, but here it was again, in a judge's quiet interference. Chief Sam Jordan called Marcus that afternoon, his voice tight. "I met with Judge Holt. He's been pulling strings for Ryan before, 2 cases in 18 and 20, both dropped early." Marcus's anger flared, not at Sam but at a system that let men like William Holt wield influence unchecked. "What did you say?" Marcus asked. Sam's reply was firm, "I told him one more move, and we go public with his calls to the board. He's under ethics review now." Marcus exhaled, a mix of relief and frustration. He'd survived because of his rank, but what about those without a Pentagon line? William Holt was a name in Georgia's legal circles, a former prosecutor turned judge with 25 years of quiet power. His neutral rulings often stalled police misconduct cases, leaving victims like Lila Brooks without recourse. Marcus thought of his own silence in the military, letting protocol excuse wrongs to protect his career. Now, facing William's interference, he felt the same guilt. Had he done enough to challenge the system, or had he just been lucky to survive it? At a closed-door meeting, Sam presented evidence, call logs showing William's late-night talks with board members, a 2018 case where Ryan's excessive force complaint was dismissed under William's review. "This isn't just about one judge," Sam said, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "It's about a system that lets power hide." Marcus nodded, his voice low. "I spent years following orders, thinking that was enough. It wasn't. We can't let men like Holt decide who gets justice." The Judicial Disciplinary Board launched an ethics probe into William, a rare move that shook the county's power structure. Marcus felt no satisfaction, only a growing resolve. He thought of his father, beaten for a taillight, and Lila, humiliated for her nurse's badge. Their stories weren't just personal, they were proof of a system rigged to protect men like Dan, Ryan, and William. Marcus's survival was a fluke, a privilege, and it burned him to know others hadn't been so lucky. That night, Marcus sat with Lena, sharing the update. Holt thought he could save his nephew, he said, his voice heavy. But he's just another wall we've got to tear down. Lena touched his hand. You're not just tearing down walls, Marcus. You're building something, hope for people like us. Marcus looked at her, his heart aching with love and responsibility. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for a world where no one needed a colonel's rank to be heard. The Eastfield Community Center was alive with voices, a low hum of stories filling the air like a long-held breath finally released. Marcus Tate stood at the back, arms crossed, watching as residents shared their experiences with police misconduct, inspired by his press conference the day before. He'd held up a letter from Tiana Wells, a 16-year-old whose father was a cop, her words shaky but clear. I'm scared my dad will be judged like those officers, but I know what happened to you was wrong. Marcus had read it aloud, his voice steady but thick with emotion, and now the town was responding. A woman in her 50s, clutching a worn purse, spoke first. Officer Carver stopped me 2 years ago, said my car didn't fit the neighborhood. He made me sit on the curb while he searched my bags. I didn't complain, thought no one would listen. A young man, barely 20, followed. I was jogging, and Holt told me I was moving suspiciously. Had to lie face down, hands cuffed, for nothing. Each story echoed Marcus's night, Dan's aggression, Ryan's silence, the system's indifference. Marcus felt a knot in his chest, not just anger but a deep empathy for these voices, silenced until now. Tiana sat in the front row, her eyes wide, her father absent but her fear palpable. Marcus had met her earlier, her letter trembling in her hands. My dad's a good cop, she'd said, but I'm scared he'll be hated because of men like Carver. Marcus had nodded, seeing his own son in her, kids forced to navigate a world where uniforms meant both safety and threat. Your voice matters, Tiana, he'd told her, and now, watching her listen, he felt a spark of hope. Her courage had lit this fire, bringing the community together. The center's organizer, a local pastor, announced a new initiative, a testimony archive, a space where anyone could share their story without fear of dismissal. No evidence needed, he said, just truth. Marcus's eyes stung, thinking of Lila Brooks, whose complaint had been buried, and his father, who'd never filed one. He'd spent years in the Air Force, following orders to keep peace, but now he saw peace wasn't enough, justice was. These stories weren't just complaints, they were a map of a broken system, and Marcus was part of redrawing it. As the meeting ended, Tiana approached, her voice soft. Thank you for reading my letter, Colonel Tate. It made me feel seen. Marcus smiled, his heart heavy but warm. You made me feel seen, too, Tiana. This isn't just my fight. He thought of his own silence, the times he'd let protocol slide to protect his career. Now, standing among these voices, he felt a shift, not just in the town, but in himself. He wasn't a symbol, he was a bridge, connecting those who'd been silenced to a chance for change. Driving home, Marcus passed the community center's sign, Your Story Matters. He thought of Tiana's fear, Lila's courage, and Jamal's video, each a thread in a larger tapestry. His anger had softened, not gone, replaced by a purpose bigger than his own survival. He was fighting for a world where Tiana's dad could wear his badge with pride, where Lila could drive without fear, where Jamal could pedal home without hiding. For the first time, Marcus felt he wasn't just staying sharp to stay alive, he was building a world where others could, too. Marcus Tate drove slowly along the northern edge of Eastfield, the same stretch of road where, over a year ago, Officer Dan Carver's boot had pinned him to the gravel. The morning was crisp, a light mist clinging to the fields, the silver SUV gliding smoothly under a sky streaked with dawn. No radio, no phone buzzing, just the hum of the engine and the memory of that night, the flashing lights, the racial slur, the command to kneel. Marcus's hands were steady on the wheel, but his chest carried a familiar ache, not pain, but the weight of what might have been without his call to General Bennett. He stopped at the bend, where faint tire marks still scarred the paint line. The engine idled, then went silent. Marcus stepped out, his loafers soft on the asphalt, no badge, no weapon, just a man revisiting a moment that had changed him. The roadside was different now, low shrubs lined the edge, a new sign read, "Speed Check Zone, monitored by camera." These were reforms born from his testimony, but Marcus hadn't come to inspect them. He'd come to feel the road, to see if it still held power over him. It didn't. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity. This place was just a road, not his story. A stone bench sat nearby, part of a community project. Etched on its backrest was a line, "Let no one kneel to survive." Marcus read it, his lips curving slightly. He thought of his father, beaten for a taillight, and Lila Brooks, humiliated for her nurse's badge. He thought of Jamal Carter, whose video had sparked a reckoning, and Tiana Wells, whose letter had pushed him to speak. Each had carried him here, to a place where survival wasn't enough, justice was. A patrol car passed, the officer, a young woman, nodding respectfully. Marcus nodded back, no tension, just a moment of mutual recognition. At the town's first civil forum, Marcus took the stage in a small library room, no podium, just a folded paper in his hand. Officer Ryan Holt stood by, silent but tense. Jamal's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, his brother's voice echoing, "Make things right." He hit record, the lens capturing the blur of Dan's aggression, Marcus's calm defiance, and Ryan's hesitation. When Dan spat a racial slur, Jamal's breath caught, but he kept filming, knowing this could be the proof Devin never had. The scene shifted as a white SUV arrived, and Chief Sam Jordan stepped out, ordering Dan and Ryan to stand down. Jamal stopped recording, his hands trembling as he slipped back into the shadows. At home, he locked his door, sank against the wall, and replayed the video. Each frame tightened his chest, Marcus's steady gaze, Dan's cruelty, the moment power flipped. Jamal thought of Devin, face down on a similar road, with no one to record, no one to call. He opened a chat with his friend Aisha, typing, "If this goes out, I'm either doing right or starting trouble." He hesitated, then uploaded the video anonymously under the handle, Street I-22, with a caption, "Not everyone has a general to save them." By morning, Jamal's phone buzzed with notifications. The video had exploded online, shared thousands of times, picked up by news outlets. "High-ranking black officer assaulted by police," screamed the headlines, but Jamal's eyes lingered on the comments, "This happens every day. What if he wasn't a colonel?" Marcus Tate's name was everywhere, but so was the question Jamal had typed, why did survival depend on rank? Marcus, now home, saw the video on his phone, Lena by his side. The footage replayed Dan's slurs, his boot, and Marcus's own voice, steady but strained, "You're making a mistake." Lena gripped his hand, tears in her eyes. "You could have been," she didn't finish, but Marcus knew. He felt the weight of his survival, the privilege of his Pentagon connection. Without it, he might have been a headline, another name lost to noncompliance. His anger surged, not at Dan but at a system that let men like him thrive. Jamal's video sparked protests outside the county courthouse, signs reading, "Justice for all, not just colonels." Marcus watched the news, his heart heavy. He thought of his father, beaten for a taillight, and Devin, whose story he'd learned from the viral post's comments. Jamal, still anonymous, felt a mix of pride and fear, knowing his video had lit a fire but unsure if it would burn him, too. As the town buzzed, Marcus resolved to speak, not for himself, but for those who'd never get the chance. Jamal, checking his phone, saw the view count climb and whispered to himself, "I didn't look away, Devon." Marcus Tate sat in a small diner off the highway, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. The news played on a muted TV in the corner, showing clips of protests sparked by Jamal Carter's viral video. Marcus's face, calm, resolute, blood-dried at the corner of his mouth, was plastered across the screen, a symbol he never wanted to be. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues at the Pentagon, but he ignored them, his mind on the stories now flooding in. Lila Brooks, a 68-year-old retired nurse, had reached out through the local paper, asking to meet. Her story, like his, was one of survival against a badge. Lila sat across from him, her hands steady but her eyes carrying the weight of years. "It was 4 years ago," she began, voice soft but firm. "I was driving home from a double shift at the hospital. Officer Carver stopped me, said I was driving too slow, like I was hiding something. He saw my nurse's badge and laughed, called me a Medicaid queen who thought I was somebody." Marcus's jaw tightened, recognizing Dan's venom. Lila continued, "He made me open my trunk, dumped my medical bag on the ground. I stayed quiet, thinking of my kids. I filed a complaint, but it went nowhere, no witnesses, no proof." Marcus nodded, his own night flashing back, the boot, the slur, the gravel. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. Lila shook her head. "Don't be. You standing up gave me a voice again." Her words hit him hard. He'd joined the Air Force to escape the powerlessness his father felt, but now he saw how many others, like Lila, had been silenced. His survival wasn't just luck, it was a chance to amplify those voices. "I was a marcher in '68, Lila added, a faint smile breaking through. "Thought we'd fixed this. Guess we're still fighting." The diner's door chimed as more stories poured in online and at community meetings. A teacher recounted Dan pulling her over for looking out of place in a school zone. A trucker described sitting on the curb for an hour while Dan searched his rig for no reason. Each story echoed Marcus's, a pattern of abuse hidden by dismissed complaints. Marcus felt a mix of rage and responsibility, rage at the system that let Dan thrive, responsibility to ensure these voices weren't buried again. Back home, Marcus sat with Lena, sharing Lila's story. "She reminded me of Dad," he said, his voice thick. "He never filed a complaint because he knew it wouldn't matter." Lena squeezed his hand. "You're making it matter now." Marcus wasn't so sure. He'd stayed silent in the military, letting protocol excuse wrongs to keep his career safe. Now, facing Lila's courage, he felt the weight of those choices. He wasn't just a colonel anymore, he was a man who'd seen too many silenced, and he couldn't look away. At a community center that night, residents gathered, inspired by the viral video. A young woman shared being stopped for suspicious behavior while jogging. An older man spoke of Dan questioning his job, his past, just for driving through a nice neighborhood. Marcus listened from the back, his heart heavy but hopeful. These weren't just stories, they were a chorus, rising against a system that had banked on their silence. Lila stood up, her voice clear. "I was scared then. I'm not now, because of Colonel Tate." The room nodded, and Marcus felt a tear slip, not for himself but for the fight he'd joined, one bigger than his own survival. Marcus Tate stood in a stark meeting room at the county's Internal Affairs office, a plain manila folder in his hands. Inside was a USB drive, delivered anonymously, labeled simply, Carver Audio. His heart raced as he plugged it into an offline laptop, the room silent except for the hum of the machine. The audio began with a car door slamming, followed by Dan Carver's voice, casual but venomous. "Any black guy in a car over 30 grand's got something dirty going on. You soft-handle them, they learn to stay humble." Ryan Holt's voice followed, quieter, agreeing, "Slicker they look, sketchier they are." Marcus's stomach twisted, not just at the words but at their ease, like prejudice was a patrol routine. He played it again, eyes closed, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just about his night, it was a window into a system that had let Dan and Ryan operate unchecked. Marcus thought of his own silence years ago, when he'd let a superior's misconduct slide to avoid conflict. That choice haunted him now, mirrored in Ryan's hesitation on the audio. The recording ended, and Marcus typed a single line in an email to the investigation team: "This is why they thought they could stop me." He hit send, not with anger but with a resolve to dismantle the culture that bred this. The internal affairs team verified the audio quickly, matching the voices to Dan and Ryan from a patrol 2 months before Marcus's stop. An anonymous email followed, from a rookie officer who'd recorded it. "I was told to rewrite reports to match Carver's narrative," the email read. "I kept this to cover myself." Marcus read the words, his mind flashing to his own reports in the Air Force, carefully worded to avoid trouble, never to expose it. He'd been part of a system, too, and the guilt stung. The investigation widened, pulling every report Dan had filed over a decade. Marcus sat in on a briefing, watching as investigators highlighted phrases: subject appeared unsteady, reached toward waistband, exhibited noncompliant tone. They were in Marcus's report, too, and dozens of others, a script to justify force. "It's not just Carver," an investigator said. "It's a culture teaching officers how to write lies that stick." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "I helped write a manual for de-escalation in 2010. It says don't use force on senior military without verified threat." They ignored it. The room grew quiet. Marcus felt the weight of his own past, times he'd followed orders, stayed silent to climb the ranks. Now, he saw the cost: a system that let men like Dan thrive, protected by vague reports and dismissed complaints. He thought of Lila Brooks, her courage in speaking out, and Jamal Carter, whose video had sparked this reckoning. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for them, for his father, for every name buried in insufficient grounds. Marcus felt it, a flicker of hope beneath the pain, and held on to it, knowing this moment would either break him or change everything. The gravel dug into Marcus Tate's knees, each sharp stone a reminder of the line he refused to cross. Officer Dan Carver loomed over him, his shadow stretching across the SUV's hood, his smirk a blade twisting in the silence. Ryan Holt stood a few paces back, his hand no longer on his Glock but clenched at his side, his face a mix of doubt and discomfort. The Georgia night was still, save for the distant hum of crickets and the faint crackle of the patrol car's radio. Marcus's back ached from Dan's kick, but his mind was clear, sharpened by years of military discipline. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't break. His father's voice, "Stay sharp, stay alive," kept him grounded, even as Dan's words echoed, "You're nothing out here." Marcus's eyes flicked to his jacket pocket, where his phone rested. He'd memorized the number years ago, a lifeline from his Pentagon days. "I need to make a call," he said, voice low but steady, like he was requesting permission to breathe. Dan's laugh was sharp, cutting through the night. "A call? To your lawyer?" "Your mama," he mocked, stepping closer, his boot nudging Marcus's knee. Ryan shifted, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing, his silence a weight Marcus could feel. "No," Marcus said, his gaze locking onto Dan's. "To someone who'll make this right." Slow, deliberate, he reached for his pocket, announcing each movement. "I'm getting my phone." Dan's smirk faltered, but he didn't stop him, perhaps sensing the shift in Marcus's tone. Ryan's hand twitched, but he stayed back, watching. Marcus dialed, the numbers etched in his memory from countless briefings. The phone rang once before a voice answered, deep and commanding, "General Laura Bennett." Marcus kept his eyes on Dan, his voice calm but firm. "It's Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Tate. I'm in Georgia, stopped by 2 officers. I'm not safe." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his rank, his service, his survival. Dan's face froze, his eyes darting to Ryan, who looked like he'd been punched. The radio crackled louder now, and a state dispatcher's voice cut through. "Carver, Holt, you are detaining Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Tate. Stand down immediately. That's an order." The air shifted, heavy with the realization that power had flipped. Dan stepped back, his hand hovering near his gun, not out of threat but reflex, as if clinging to the authority slipping away. Ryan's shoulders slumped, his eyes wide with shock. Marcus rose slowly, brushing gravel from his palms, his movements deliberate, not triumphant. The pain in his back throbbed, but his spine stayed straight, his gaze unyielding. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a black leather wallet. Under the patrol car's glare, he opened it, revealing his Air Force ID, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Tate, United States Air Force, Pentagon. Dan's mouth opened, but no words came. Ryan stared at the ID, his face pale, as if seeing his career dissolve. Marcus didn't speak, letting the ID do the talking. The silence was louder than any shout, heavier than the boot that had struck him. He thought of his father, beaten for less, and his son, who'd never know this moment but would carry its weight. The anger was there, but so was relief, not just for surviving, but for proving he was more than what Dan saw. Headlights cut through the darkness as a white SUV pulled up, no sirens, just quiet authority. Chief Samuel Jordan stepped out, his face grim but resolute. He didn't glance at Dan or Ryan, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "Colonel Tate," he said, voice low, respectful. "I'm sorry this happened." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "I hope your officers know what their badge means," he said, not accusing but demanding accountability. Sam turned to Dan and Ryan, his tone cold. "Badges and weapons. Now." Dan stammered, "We didn't know," but Sam cut him off. "Body cam footage is already being reviewed. Don't make this worse." Marcus stood still, the weight of the night settling in, humiliation, fear, but also the clarity of knowing he'd survived because of a call most couldn't make. As Dan and Ryan handed over their badges, Marcus's mind drifted to his father's bruised face, to the countless others who never had a General Bennett to call. He wasn't just a colonel tonight, he was a man who'd stood up, and that felt like both a victory and a burden. The patrol car's lights still flashed, painting the Georgia roadside in pulses of red and blue. Marcus Tate stood by his SUV, his Air Force ID back in his pocket, the gravel dust still clinging to his slacks. Officer Dan Carver and Officer Ryan Holt stood apart, their badges and weapons now in Chief Sam Jordan's hands. The air was thick, not with tension but with the weight of a moment that had shattered expectations. Marcus's back throbbed from Dan's kick, but the pain was secondary to the storm in his chest, anger at the injustice, relief at surviving, and a gnawing guilt that his rank had saved him where others might have fallen. Sam's voice broke the silence, steady but heavy. "Colonel Tate, we'll need a statement. This isn't over." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of dawn crept in. "I'll give one," he said, "but this isn't just about me." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every stop he'd endured, every story his father had told him, every name he'd read in the news, black men who didn't walk away. He thought of his son, Jamal, asleep at home, and the promise he'd made to protect him from nights like this. Dan stood rigid, his face pale, the smirk gone. "We didn't know who you were," he muttered, as if it excused the slur, the shove, the boot. Ryan looked away, his hands clenched, the conflict in his eyes clearer now. Marcus didn't respond. Their ignorance wasn't the point, it was the assumption that his skin made him less, that a nice car and a suit were crimes. He remembered his father's words after that long-ago beating, "They don't need to know you to hurt you." Marcus had climbed the ranks to escape that truth, but tonight proved it still lingered. Sam gestured to the internal affairs officers who'd arrived with him. They pulled out a tablet, already replaying body cam footage. Dan's voice echoed from the screen, "You didn't rent this car, did you? Just another black guy who forgot his place." Marcus's stomach churned, not at the words but at hearing them again, preserved, undeniable. Ryan's silence in the footage was just as loud, his hesitation a choice to let Dan lead. The IA officer paused the video, her voice clipped. "This is hate-motivated conduct. You're done here." Marcus watched as Dan and Ryan were led to the second SUV, their heads low, no longer officers but men facing consequences. He felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. He'd survived because of a call to General Bennett, a privilege most didn't have. His mind flashed to a night in Afghanistan, when he'd stayed silent as a superior overlooked a soldier's misconduct to keep the unit tight. That silence had haunted him, and now, standing here, he vowed it wouldn't define him again. As the SUVs pulled away, Sam approached. "We'll handle this, Colonel. You have my word." Marcus met his eyes, searching for sincerity. Sam's face was lined with fatigue, but there was something else, guilt, maybe, for a system he'd helped run. "Make sure it's not just words," Marcus said softly, then turned to his car. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his aching back. The engine hummed to life, but he didn't drive yet. He sat, staring at the road, the weight of the night pressing down. He thought of Lena, waiting at home, and the pot roast she'd kept warm. He thought of his father, whose bruises had faded but whose lessons hadn't. And he thought of the others, names he didn't know, faces he'd never see, who'd faced Dan's boot or worse and had no Pentagon to call. Marcus gripped the wheel, his knuckles tight, not from anger but from a resolve forming deep within. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was theirs, too, and he'd make sure it was heard. Jamal Carter pedaled through the Georgia night, his delivery bag heavy with the last order of his shift. The air smelled of fried chicken and pine, a faint breeze cooling the sweat on his brow. At 22, Jamal was a criminal justice major, driven by the memory of his brother, Devin, killed 3 years ago in a police stop gone wrong. "Make things right," Devin had said once, and Jamal carried that promise like a torch. He was almost home when red and blue lights flashed ahead, near a bend by an empty lot. Instinctively, he slowed, pulling behind a tree, his heart racing. A black SUV was pulled over, its driver, Marcus Tate, on his knees, hands raised. Officer Dan Carver stood over him, shouting, his boot slamming into Marcus's back. Marcus Tate was no stranger to the weight of a uniform, but tonight, it wasn't his Air Force blues that defined him, it was the way the Georgia moonlight caught the polished edges of his silver SUV. At 45, Marcus, a lieutenant colonel stationed at the Pentagon, carried himself with the quiet precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades navigating battlefields and boardrooms. His close-cropped hair was flecked with gray, his eyes sharp but tired from a long drive home from D.C. to his family in Macon. The road stretched dark and empty, a rural ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields dotted with amber farmhouse lights. He kept the radio off, savoring the hum of the engine, a rare moment of peace after a week of briefings where every word could shift the fate of soldiers half a world away. In the passenger seat, his phone blinked with a text from his wife, Lena, "Pot roast in the oven. Don't let it get cold." Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. Lena's cooking was his anchor, a reminder of the life he'd built despite the odds. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, Marcus had watched his father, a bus driver, come home with bruises from a police stop over a broken taillight. "Stay sharp, stay alive," his father had said, words that stuck like a mantra. Those words had driven Marcus to the Air Force, to a rank that demanded respect, a shield against the world that had hurt his father. But tonight, as he crossed a quiet bridge, that shield felt far away. Red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, sharp as a warning shot. Marcus's stomach tightened, but his hands stayed steady on the wheel. No speeding, no broken lights, no violations. He'd checked his speedometer twice, habit of a black man who knew the rules didn't always apply. He signaled, pulled over slowly, and killed the engine. The silence wasn't calm anymore, it was heavy, like the air before a storm. Marcus placed both hands on the wheel, palms up, just as he'd taught his teenage son, Jamal, years ago. Never give them a reason, he'd said, hating that he had to teach it. Two figures emerged from the patrol car, their silhouettes blurred by the glare of headlights. The shorter one, Officer Daniel Carver, moved fast, boots crunching gravel with purpose. His partner, Officer Ryan Holt, hung back, hand near his holster, eyes scanning like a soldier awaiting orders. Dan's voice cut through the night, sharp and cold. "Engine off, hands on the wheel. Don't make me repeat myself." Marcus flicked on the cabin light, his face calm but etched with the weariness of a man who'd been here before. At 19, he'd been stopped for looking suspicious near his college dorm. At 30, a cop had questioned his military ID at a gas station. Each time, he'd swallowed the anger, stayed sharp, stayed alive. Now, at 45, he felt the same old weight, heavier with every year. "What's the reason for the stop, officer?" he asked, voice even, respectful, but firm. Dan scoffed, his small eyes narrowing as he leaned toward the window. "This car. You didn't rent it, did you?" The question wasn't curious, it was an accusation, laced with a smirk that said he'd already decided the answer. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze steady. "It's mine," he said, each word measured. Ryan stepped closer, his radio crackling faintly. "Registration. Now." His tone was flat, but his eyes flicked to Dan, uncertain. Marcus spoke clearly, "I'm reaching for my wallet in the console." No response. He moved slowly, pulling out his license and registration, and handed them over. Dan snatched them, barely glancing before stuffing them into his pocket. "Where you coming from?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Step out of the car." Marcus's heart thudded, but his training kicked in, control the breath, control the moment. He stepped out, hands raised just enough to be clear, movements deliberate. Dan stood close, his breath sour with coffee and disdain. "What do you do, huh? This kind of car ain't common around here." His eyes raked over Marcus's pressed slacks, his crisp shirt, as if they were evidence of a crime. "I'm heading home," Marcus said, voice steady despite the memory of his father's bruised face flashing in his mind. Dan sneered. "Home? What, some fancy condo in the city? Or you one of those types thinking a suit makes you better than us?" Marcus didn't answer. He knew this script, every word designed to provoke, to justify what came next. But inside, the anger burned, not at Dan, but at the world that let men like him wear a badge. The Georgia night pressed in, the air thick with the scent of damp grass and diesel. Marcus Tate stood by his SUV, hands raised, the patrol car's headlights casting long shadows across the gravel. Officer Dan Carver circled him like a predator sizing up prey, his boots scuffing the dirt with deliberate menace. Ryan Holt lingered near the rear of the vehicle, his hand still hovering near his Glock, his face a mask of unease. Marcus's heart pounded, but he kept his eyes forward, refusing to let them waver. His father's voice echoed in his head, "Stay sharp, stay alive." He'd survived war zones, Kandahar, Baghdad, but this roadside felt like its own battlefield, where the enemy wore a badge. Dan stopped in front of Marcus, close enough that the sour tang of his breath stung the air. "What's your deal, huh? Driving this fancy car, acting all high and mighty," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Just another black guy who forgot his place." The words hit like a fist, but Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, slurs in basic training, whispers in Pentagon hallways, but none carried the weight of a gun at his side. His fingers twitched, not from fear but from the effort to keep his anger caged. "I'm just trying to get home, officer," Marcus said, his tone calm, almost mechanical, honed by years of diffusing tension in high-stakes missions. But Dan's eyes narrowed, searching for a crack, a reason to escalate. "Home," he mocked, stepping closer. "You don't belong in a car like this. Where'd you get it? Steal it?" Or you one of those welfare kings living off the system? The racial slur he spat next, sharp, ugly, and deliberate, cut deeper than Marcus expected. His chest tightened, memories of his father's battered face merging with the present, but he forced his breathing to stay even. Ryan shifted, his boots crunching faintly. Dan, maybe we should, he started, but Dan cut him off with a glare. Stay out of it, Holt, he snapped, turning back to Marcus. Get on your knees. Now. The command was a growl, a test of dominance. Marcus's mind raced, comply and lose dignity, resist and risk everything. He thought of his son, Jamal, waiting at home, and Lena, who'd never forgive him if he didn't make it back. I'm not a threat, Marcus said, voice steady but firm. I'm following your orders. Dan's face twisted, and without warning, he shoved Marcus hard in the chest. Marcus stumbled, catching himself with one hand on the SUV's hood. Before he could straighten, Dan's boot slammed into his back, sending him to his knees. Pain shot through his spine, but Marcus didn't cry out. The gravel bit into his palms, and the cold seeped through his slacks, but worse was the humiliation, a black man, a decorated officer, reduced to dirt by someone who saw only skin. His father's words rang louder, stay alive. He clung to them, forcing the rage down, knowing one wrong move could end it all. Ryan stood frozen, his hand still near his gun, eyes darting between Dan and Marcus. Dan, come on, this is enough, he said, voice low, almost pleading. But Dan crouched beside Marcus, his breath hot against his ear. You can wear a suit, talk all proper, but you're nothing out here, he hissed. Just a well-dressed nobody who needs to learn his place. Marcus's blood roared, but he kept his head up, eyes locked on the horizon, refusing to give Dan the satisfaction of breaking him. Inside, Marcus was a storm, anger at Dan's cruelty, fear for his life, and guilt for every time he'd stayed silent in the past, thinking his rank would shield him. He remembered a night in Iraq, watching a junior officer get away with harassing locals because protocol covered it. He'd said nothing then, protecting his career. Now, on this roadside, that silence haunted him. But he wasn't silent now. You're making a mistake, he said softly, not a threat but a warning, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd faced death and walked away. Dan laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. He stood, nudging Marcus with his boot like he was inspecting cargo. Mistake? The only mistake is you thinking you're somebody. He turned to Ryan, expecting a nod, but Ryan's face was tight, his eyes fixed on Marcus's unflinching gaze. Something shifted in the air, not power, not yet, but the first crack in Dan's control.